The ship was quiet at that hour. Most of the crew were asleep, and the only sounds inside the ironclad dawn were the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft beep from the navigation console. The vessel drifted slowly through the outer edge of the Vega cluster, running a routine cartography scan that nobody on board expected to produce anything interesting. It was, by all measures, a boring assignment. Commander Cole Hargrove sat in the captain's chair with a cup of synthetic coffee going cold in his hand. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a short gray beard that his crew often said made him look more like a dock worker than a fleet officer. He had served in 2 border conflicts and had the kind of calm that only comes from having been genuinely afraid many times and surviving every single one of those moments. He was not a dramatic man. He fixed problems. At that moment, his problem was the coffee, which tasted like it had been brewed inside a machine that had forgotten what coffee was supposed to be. He set the cup down on the armrest and stared at the star map projected on the forward screen. Lieutenant Nora Ellison was at the comm station. She was 29, sharp-eyed, and the kind of person who noticed things before other people knew there was anything to notice. She had been quietly running a background frequency scan, something she did out of habit rather than any specific order, when a signal appeared on her screen that did not belong there. It was faint, broken. It came in fragments, like something that had been traveling a very long distance and had lost most of its strength along the way. It was also not human. "Commander," she said, and her voice had that particular flatness that meant she was trying not to react yet. "I'm picking something up on an unregistered frequency. Low band, fragmented. It's not one of ours." Cole put down his coffee and stood up. "Run it through translation." "Already started," she said. "It's Valley encoding. Old format, deep compression. The ship's AI is working on it now." Cole walked to her station and stood behind her, reading the fragments as they came through. The Valley were a species humanity had known for about 60 years. They were small, soft-spoken beings with bioluminescent skin. They communicated partly through light patterns, partly through sound. They were known for 3 things: their extraordinary organic libraries, their philosophy of complete nonviolence, and the fact that they had never once in their recorded history raised a weapon against another living creature. They were, as one human diplomat had once put it, the galaxy's gentle neighbors, the kind you never worried about and always wished lived closer. The translation came through in pieces. "Colony worlds, burning. Cannot stop them. Have no weapons. Have never needed weapons. The Dravhari do not speak. They only destroy. They have taken Vel Orath. They have taken the singing archive of Kess. 4 more colonies have gone dark. We are broadcasting to every registered contact in our diplomatic index. Please, if anyone hears this, we are dying." The message looped. It had clearly been broadcasting for some time, days, possibly longer. The AI estimated the signal had originated from deep inside the Vega cluster, roughly 11 light days from their current position. Cole read it again, then a 3rd time. The ship was still quiet around him. The engines hummed. The stars outside held their positions, indifferent and cold. "How many species are in their diplomatic registry?" he asked. Nora checked. 43 registered contacts, mostly cluster local civilizations, a few farther out, us included. "Any responses on the same frequency? Anyone else answering the call?" She scanned for a long moment. "No, sir. Nothing. Just the loop." Cole straightened up. He looked at the star map. He looked at the message fragments on the screen. He thought about the Karathi raids from 20 years ago, the border colonies that had burned while the council debated response timelines. He thought about the people who had waited for help that arrived too late to matter. Get me a channel to Fleet Command, he said. Priority 1. Don't filter it through the standard relay. Use the deep burst transmitter. Nora looked at him briefly. That'll wake people up back home. Good, he said. They should be awake. While she prepared the channel, Cole walked to the forward screen and pulled up everything on file about the Dravhari Dominion. Humanity had only peripheral data on them, collected second-hand from other species' records. The Dravhari were a Tier 6 civilization, meaning they had faster-than-light capability, established territorial control across multiple systems, and a functioning military doctrine. They were described in the records as expansionist, hierarchical, and contemptuous of what they classified as non-combatant species. Non-combatant. Cole turned the word over in his mind. It meant species that did not fight, species like the Veli. The Dravhari, it seemed, had decided that not fighting was the same as not mattering. The file included one additional note, added by a human xenopolitical analyst about 12 years ago. It read, "The Dominion has shown a consistent pattern of absorbing or eliminating civilizations that present no military resistance. They appear to interpret pacifism as an absence of consequence. No direct conflict with Terran interests recorded to date. Monitoring recommended." Monitoring recommended. Cole closed the file. The channel to Fleet Command opened with a burst of static, then cleared. A tired-sounding duty officer appeared on the small screen at the comm station. It was late by Earth Standard Time, which explained the look on his face. "Ironclad Dawn, this is Fleet Command. You're on a priority burst. What's the situation?" "This is Commander Hargrove," Cole said. "I'm transmitting a full copy of a Veli distress signal we've intercepted in the Vega cluster. I need it in front of the Council within the hour. The Veli are being systematically destroyed by the Dravhari Dominion. Colony worlds are gone. Their archive systems are being burned. They have no military capacity, and no one is answering their call." There was a pause. "Commander, is this a formal incident report or—" "It's a request," Cole said quietly. "I'm requesting that someone with authority listens to this message and decides what humanity is going to do about it. I'll be standing by." He ended the transmission and sat back down in the captain's chair. Nora looked over at him from the comm station. The rest of the bridge crew, those who had been awake, were very still. "Do you think they'll act on it?" she asked. Cole picked up his cold coffee, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down. "I think," he said, "that whoever plays that message in that room is going to have a very hard time doing nothing afterward." He looked at the looping fragments still scrolling across her screen. "Some things don't let you stay quiet once you've heard them." The ironclad Dawn held its position in the dark, engines humming, while the signal kept broadcasting its quiet, broken plea into the void. And 11 light days away, the Veli waited, not knowing yet that somewhere in the cold distance, a human had heard them, and had already started making calls. The council chamber in Geneva was not built for comfort. It was built for decisions. The seats were hard, the lighting was flat and bright, and the long oval table in the center had seen more arguments than most people had hot meals. On a normal day, it held the quiet tension of political disagreement. On the morning that Commander Cole Hargrove's transmission arrived, it held something heavier than that. 31 council members had been called in within 18 hours of the priority burst. Some had come from other continents. 2 had joined by remote link from off-world stations. They all looked tired. Several of them looked annoyed. That changed when the message played. Councilwoman Avery Strand sat near the center of the table and listened without moving. She was 51 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had long ago stopped caring what she looked like, and started caring only about what she said. She had been a trauma surgeon before she entered politics. 12 years working in emergency medicine on the outer colony stations, where resources were thin and decisions had to be made fast and lived with forever. She had lost her home colony of Heron Station in the Karathi raids when she was 33. She did not talk about that often. She did not need to. People who knew her understood that it was the reason for everything she had done since. She listened to the Veili message twice. The room was silent both times. When it finished the second time, a council member from the Eastern Bloc, a careful, deliberate man named Gerald Voss, leaned forward and said what several others were thinking. We have no territorial interest in the Vega cluster. The Dravhari have not moved against any human world or human asset. Entering a conflict with a Tier 6 civilization over a third party is not a decision to be made in one morning. There were nods around the table. Avery looked at him. Then she picked up her copy of the translated message. She had printed it, which was something almost nobody did anymore, and she read it aloud. Not a summary, not selected parts, the whole thing from the first fragmented line to the last broken plea. She read it slowly, and she did not skip the silences where the signal had degraded and the words had dropped out, because those silences were part of it too. When she finished, she set the paper down. I'm not going to tell anyone here how to vote, she said. But I want it to be clear that we all heard this, every word of it, so that whatever we decide it knowing exactly what we decided. The debate went on for 4 hours. There were real concerns raised. Logistics, risk, the possibility of a wider conflict pulling in other Dominion-aligned powers. Those concerns were not dismissed. They were written down, examined, and answered as honestly as the available information allowed. In the end, the vote passed, 14-3. The chamber cleared quickly after that. There was no celebrating. Nobody shook hands. People simply stood up and went to make the calls that needed to be made, because a decision like that one does not pause for ceremony. Admiral Dean Calloway got his orders while sitting on the back porch of his house in coastal Virginia, watching the water. He was 60 years old, lean and unhurried, with a reputation across the fleet for being the calmest man in any room that contained him. He had commanded 3 fleet engagements and had never once raised his voice during any of them. His crews found this either reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on who you asked. He read the orders once, set down his drink, and went inside to pack. Within 48 hours, the Terran 3rd Combined Expeditionary Fleet was being assembled at the Titan station yards. It was not the largest fleet humanity had ever put together, but it was not small either. 38 warships, including the heavy carrier TNS Relentless Earth, 2 destroyer squadrons, 4 long-range strike frigates, and a support train of fuel tenders and medical vessels. Captain Lena Corvo of the Relentless Earth received her activation order while still running post-maintenance checks on her ship's secondary drive systems. She was 40 years old, dark-haired, and moved through her ship with the easy familiarity of someone who knew every bolt and panel of it personally. She had commanded the Relentless Earth for 6 years. She trusted it, the way you trust something that has never let you down, even when it had every reason to. She called her department heads together within the hour. She told them where they were going and why. She did not give a speech about duty or honor. She told them the facts, she told them the timeline, and she told them to make sure their people were ready. Then she dismissed them and went back to the drive system checks, because a ship that was not mechanically sound was just an expensive coffin, and she had no interest in expensive coffins. Gunnery Master Chief Aaron Pike got the call while in the middle of a meal at the enlisted mess. He was 38, built like something that had been assembled rather than born, with thick forearms and a calm face that showed almost nothing under almost any circumstances. His record included 17 years of fleet service, 2 commendations for damage control under fire, and 1 incident at the Battle of Kessera Point, where he had held a collapsing internal bulkhead closed with his body for 11 minutes, while his crew evacuated the section behind him. He had fractured 3 ribs doing it. He had not mentioned this until a medic noticed his breathing was wrong 2 days later. He finished his meal, put his tray away, and went to wake his team. Alongside the warships, a smaller vessel was being prepared, a diplomatic courier called the Steady Hand, assigned to make first contact with the Veli survivors before the fleet entered any engagement zone. Xenolinguist Petra Wald was assigned as lead communicator. She was 35, quiet, methodical, and had spent the last 11 years studying Veli language and culture from recordings and second-hand academic sources. She had never met a Veli in person. She found this fact both exciting and terrifying in roughly equal measure. Assigned with her was Alien Affairs Coordinator Danny Forsyth, a 32-year-old former field diplomat with a talent for reading rooms and keeping conversations from falling apart. He was the kind of person who noticed when tension was rising before anyone had said anything wrong, and knew how to redirect it before it became a problem. He and Petra had worked together twice before. They got along well, which in their field was rarer than it sounded. The fleet moved out from Titan Station on the third day after the council vote. The ships formed up in fold space formation and jumped in sequence, one after another, their drive signatures fading from the station's sensors like lights going out in a row. On the departure record, the mission classification was listed as humanitarian response with military escort. It was technically accurate. It did not fully capture what the fleet was or what it was going to do. Far away, the Dravhari Dominion's long-range monitoring systems picked up the fold space signatures of 38 ships moving in coordinated formation toward the Vega cluster. The report was passed up through the Dominion's intelligence chain, assessed, and filed under low priority. Humanity was, as far as the Dominion's records were concerned, a mid-tier biological species with a history of internal conflict and no psionic capacity. Their ships were metal and fire. Their lifespans were short. They had no business in Dominion expansion corridors. The file was updated and set aside. Nobody told High Warlord Vetharoon to worry about it. Not fire. The fire had already finished its work days ago. What remained was a slow, dark smear across the upper atmosphere of the Veli colony world below them, spreading wide and thin like ink dropped into still water. The planet itself was not dead. The land was still there, the ocean still moved, and somewhere down in the lower atmosphere the clouds still turned in their slow patterns. But the cities were gone. The orbital structures were gone. What little remained of them drifted in loose fragments across the ship's proximity sensors. Broken metal, shattered crystal, pieces of things that had once been beautiful and were now just debris. Admiral Dean Calloway stood at the forward viewport of the TNS Relentless Earth and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Around him, the bridge crew worked quietly, running scans, logging the debris field, checking for active Dravhari signatures in the system. There were none. They had finished here and left the way a fire moves on once it has run out of things to burn. "What are we reading on the surface?" Calloway asked. The sensor officer, a young woman named Kay Briggs, pulled up the thermal scan. "There's a heat signature in the southern continent, sir. Concentrated. It's inside what's left of a shelter dome, one of the Veli emergency structures. The dome is partially intact." She paused. "I'm reading biological signs, a lot of them. They're alive down there." Calloway nodded once. "Get Petra and Danny to their shuttle. I want them on the ground within the hour." The shuttle came down through the haze slowly, picking its way through the chemical residue in the upper atmosphere. Petra sat at the small porthole and watched the ground come up to meet them. From the air, the colony looked like something that had been stepped on. The wide, luminous structures that characterized Veli architecture, tall, organic towers that caught light and distributed it through entire city blocks like living lamps, had been reduced to dark stumps and scattered rubble. The broad plazas where Veli gathered to sing their light songs were cracked and gray. The gardens, which by all records had been extraordinary, were ash. Petra had studied Valley culture for 11 years. She had read every record, every translated document, every second-hand account from other species who had visited their worlds. She had built her entire professional life around understanding them from a distance. Now she was here, and what she felt, looking at what remained of this place, was not the careful academic emotion she had expected. It was something simpler and harder. It sat in her chest, like a stone. Danny was beside her, reading the approach data on his handheld. He had been in enough difficult places to know when words did not help. The shuttle landed outside the shelter dome. The ground crunched underfoot, a layer of fine gray residue that covered everything, the remains of the incendiary compounds the Dravari had used. The dome itself was a large curved structure made of reinforced organic material, cracked along one side, but still standing. The entrance had been sealed from the inside. Petra activated her translation unit and sent a standard Valley greeting tone through the external speaker. A gentle, low-frequency sound, the Valley equivalent of knocking politely and identifying yourself as safe. There was a long wait. Then, the seal on the entrance shifted, and the door opened. The Valley who looked out at them were not what Petra had expected, and she realized immediately that she had been thinking of them as they appeared in recordings. Luminous, calm, moving with the unhurried grace of beings who had never known threat. These Valley were none of those things. They were dim. Their bioluminescent skin, which should have cycled through soft colors, the way breathing cycles through rhythm, was nearly dark. They were thin. They moved carefully, the way beings move when they are conserving the last of something. There were roughly 4,000 of them inside the dome. They had been there for 9 days. The elder came forward slowly. It was a Valley called Esselvan. Petra recognized the name from the survivor list the ship's AI had pieced together from partial records. Esselvan was very old, even by Valley standards, and carried 3 damaged data crystals pressed against its chest with both hands. Those crystals, Petra knew, contained fragments of their library, records, histories, songs, accumulated knowledge that the Valley had been gathering and tending for longer than humanity had been writing things down. Esselvan had carried them out of the burning archive and had not put them down since. The elder looked at Petra and Danny for a long moment. Then it began to glow. Not brightly, not the full warm light of a Valley in comfort and safety, but it glowed, a soft trembling gold that moved in slow pulses across its skin. Petra had studied enough Valley light language to know what the pattern meant. It was the expression that the Valley used when something had happened that was almost too large to hold. Relief so deep it had no bottom. Petra's translation unit rendered Esselvan's first words carefully. "You came," it said. "We did not know if anyone would come." "We came," Petra said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. She sat with Esselvan for 2 hours inside the dome, listening. Danny sat with them, logging everything, asking gentle questions when the elder paused. What emerged was a picture that was worse than the initial distress signal had suggested. The Dravari had not simply attacked the Valley. They had been doing it for decades, slowly, methodically, working their way through the cluster, erasing non-combatant civilizations one at a time. Other species had been taken before the Valley. Some had submitted and been absorbed, their cultures dissolved into dominion structure. The Valley had been watching it happen from a distance, hoping it would stop, hoping the dominion would turn another direction. It had not turned. It had kept coming. "We could not fight," Esselvan said. "We have never fought. We do not know how." "You don't need to know how," Petra said. "That's not why we're here." She sent the full recording back up to the relentless earth. Calloway listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When it finished, He sat quietly for a moment, then turned to his comms officer. "Get me the fleet captains," he said. "All of them, now." Cole Hargrove, reassigned from the ironclad Dawn to a scout corvette that had attached itself to the fleet's outer perimeter, was watching from his bridge when the warships began to move. He had seen fleets form up before. He had seen combat formations and patrol patterns and defensive screens. This was different. The ships were not arranging themselves defensively. They were pointing outward, toward the inner cluster, toward the direction the Dravhari had gone. It was the posture of something that had decided. Cole stood at his viewport and watched the fleet align itself against the dark. And he thought that somewhere in the Dominion's sensor network, a signal was traveling toward High Warlord Veth Orun that the Warlord was not going to enjoy receiving. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Here were 140 vessels in that group. Warships, escort carriers, and heavy gun platforms, arranged in the clean, orderly formation that Dominion doctrine had always favored. It was a powerful force by any reasonable measure. High Warlord Veth Orun commanded it from the bridge of his flagship, a massive vessel called the Dominion's Patience, and he had never once in his military career had reason to feel anything other than completely confident in his position. The alert told him that 38 vessels had entered the outer range of his sensor grid and were moving toward him in coordinated formation. The vessel classification came back as Terran, human ships. He looked at the number, 38, and then looked at his own formation of 140. And he felt something that was not quite concern, but was adjacent to it. He simply wanted to understand why a species with no stake in this region had come here with warships. He sent a dominance broadcast. It was standard procedure, a declaration of territorial claim, a list of the civilizations already absorbed or destroyed as proof of the Dominion's reach, and a formal recommendation that the approaching fleet reverse course and leave. The broadcast had worked on every species the Dominion had encountered in the last 40 years. Some had turned around immediately. Some had needed a second broadcast. None had kept coming. The Terran fleet kept coming. Then the response arrived. It had been translated into Dravhari by someone who clearly knew the language well, because every word landed exactly as intended. "You misread our silence for indifference. We were simply on our way." Veth Orun read it twice. Then he ordered his fleet to battle stations. The first exchange happened at long range, both sides firing across a gap of several thousand kilometers, probing, testing, reading how the other moved. The Dravhari opened with their standard suppression pattern, a wide spread of heavy energy bolts designed to force an enemy into a defensive posture and keep them there. It worked on most opponents. Most opponents, when hit, slowed down, pulled back, tried to regroup behind whatever cover they could find. The Terran ships did not pull back. The TNS Relentless Earth took the first serious hit, a concentrated burst from 3 Dravhari gun platforms that struck the carrier's midsection and tore through 2 outer decks. On any other ship, in any other fleet that Veth Orun had ever faced, that would have been the moment things changed. The damaged ship would slow, or veer off, or signal distress. Something would shift. Captain Lena Corvo's voice came across the internal channel of the Relentless Earth about 4 seconds after the hit. Calm and even. The way you talk when you need everyone around you to stay calm and even. Damage control to decks 7 and 8. Seal the breach on frame 42. Engineering, I need a power reroute to the secondary launch bay within 3 minutes. We are not stopping. They did not stop. Aaron Pike was already moving before the order finished. He had felt the hit through the deck plates, the way a person feels a punch, not just with the part that was struck, but with everything. He came out of the damage control station at a run, pulling his team behind him, barking instructions that were precise and fast and left no room for confusion. The breach on frame 42 was bad. A section of outer hull had folded inward, and one of the structural supports was bending under pressure it was not designed to handle. Pike assessed it in about 2 seconds, grabbed a brace bar from the emergency rack on the wall, and started directing people into position with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before, under worse conditions. "Corvo, I need 4 minutes, not 3, he said into his comm. "You have 3.5, she said. "Fine," he said, and got to work. Above them, the battle was spreading across a wide stretch of space as both fleets maneuvered for position. The Dravhari had numbers, and they used them, trying to encircle the Terran formation and compress it. It was a tactic that had worked reliably for them. Surround, tighten, overwhelm, clean, orderly, effective. The problem was that the humans did not behave like anything the Dominion's tactical models predicted. Terran ships that took damage did not retreat. They adjusted. A frigate that lost its forward guns moved to a flanking position and used its working weapons from there. A destroyer that took a hit to its drive system cut its engines entirely and let itself drift, which confused the Dravhari targeting systems long enough for 2 other Terran ships to use the distraction. The scout corvette that Cole Hargrove was commanding had no business being in the middle of a fleet engagement, but Cole had spent 20 years learning how to use a small, fast ship in ways that made larger ships nervous, and he spent the first 3 hours of the battle running interference patterns that pulled Dravhari targeting attention at exactly the moments the bigger Terran ships needed it pulled. What Veth Oruan was watching, from the bridge of the Dominion's patience, was not what he expected war to look like. War, in his experience, had a logic to it. Ships took damage, and that damage meant something. It degraded capability, it reduced will, it added up toward a breaking point. The Terrans seemed to have a different relationship with damage than any species he had encountered. They treated it not as a sign that they were losing, but as a problem to solve and move past. And then they kept fighting. By the 4th hour, he had lost 11 ships. The Terrans had lost none, though several were badly hurt. By the 5th hour, his encirclement tactic had failed completely. The Terran formation had broken and reformed 3 times, in ways his tactical officers could not predict or prepare for, and each time it reformed, it was in a slightly better position than before. By the 6th hour, Veth did something that no Dravhari High Warlord had done in 40 years of Dominion expansion. He requested a communications channel. The face that appeared on his screen was that of Admiral Dean Calloway, calm, unhurried, showing nothing that looked like anger or triumph, or any of the emotions Veth would have expected from an enemy commander in the middle of a battle. He looked, if anything, like a man who was doing a task he had prepared for and was simply working through it. "High Warlord," Calloway said. "You are not what our records described," Veth said. He was not a being who wasted words. "Our records on you were also incomplete," Calloway replied. "That tends to happen when 2 parties have never had cause to test each other." There was a pause. On both flagships, weapons were still armed, crews still at stations, the battle suspended in a strange temporary stillness. "What are you?" Veth asked. It was a genuine question. Calloway considered it for a moment. "We are the ones who came when the Veli called. I think if you sit with that answer long enough, it will tell you everything you actually need to know." The channel closed. The battle resumed within minutes. But something had shifted in the Dominion's formation. A hesitation, barely visible. Like a machine that had encountered a variable it had not been built to process. Veth commanders were still fighting. They were just no longer entirely sure what they were fighting. On the relentless Earth, Aaron Pike sealed the last breach on frame 42, stood up straight, and told his team they had done well. Then he went to find out where the next problem was. There was always a next problem. That was fine. That was what they were there for. Wars rarely do. The first engagement had broken the Dravhari forward battle group and forced it back. But the Dominion was large, and large things do not stop moving simply because one part of them has been hit. 2 more engagements followed over the next 9 days. The first was at the far edge of the Kef Nebula, where a second Dravhari force had been waiting in reserve, hoping to catch the Terran fleet from behind while it dealt with Veth Oruan's group. It was not a bad plan. It did not work. Cole Hargrove's stout corvette picked up their fold space entry signature 40 minutes before they arrived, and relayed the warning to Calloway, who had enough time to reposition 3 destroyers and a frigate squadron to meet them before they finished forming up. The second engagement was in open void above a Dravhari supply station near the edge of their territorial boundary, a place where the Dominion had stored fuel, munitions, and replacement parts for the expansion fleet. Taking it out was not dramatic. It was methodical. The kind of work that is not glorious but is necessary, like pulling a weed out by the root instead of just cutting the stem. Both engagements were won. Neither was easy. By the end of the 9 days, 41 members of the Terran fleet were dead. Their names were recorded carefully, read aloud at a brief ceremony on the relentless Earth, while the ship sat in low orbit above the Viali colony, with its hull still showing the scorch marks and sealed breach lines from the fighting. Captain Lena Corvo stood at the front of the assembly bay and read every name herself. She did not rush it. Each name got the same pause after it, long enough to mean something, short enough to keep going. Aaron Pike stood in the back of the room with his damage control team. Several of them had injuries that had been bandaged and cleared as non-critical. Pike himself had a deep bruise across his left shoulder from a falling support strut during the second battle's hull breach, which he had not mentioned to the medical team, because there was always something more urgent for them to deal with. He stood straight and listened to the names and said nothing. After the ceremony, Lena walked the length of the ship alone. She did this after every action, a quiet habit, just her and the corridors, checking on people informally, stopping to talk when someone needed to talk. The ship would need 6 months in dry dock when they got home. 2 decks were still sealed. Several systems were running on backup power. The relentless Earth had been hit hard, and it showed. But it was still flying, and the people inside it were still standing. And in Lena's experience, that was the only measure of a ship that actually mattered. Councilwoman Avery Strand arrived on the diplomatic courier 3 days after the last engagement. She had insisted on coming herself to handle the Dravhari capitulation terms. Fleet Command had pushed back on this. It was not standard practice for a sitting council member to travel into a post-conflict zone while the situation was still being stabilized. Avery had listened to their concerns, acknowledged them, and then boarded the courier anyway. She met with Veth Oruan aboard a neutral platform, a decommissioned Vali orbital station that had survived the Dravhari attacks because it had been too small and too far out to be worth targeting. It was a bare functional space, lit by portable lamps the humans had brought, with a folding table between them and nothing else. Veth Oruan looked different from the recordings Avery had reviewed. In those recordings he had carried the particular stillness of a commander who had never lost. Now, he sat across from her with 4 of his 6 limbs bandaged, and the careful expression of a being who was recalculating everything it had believed about the shape of the galaxy. Avery placed the terms document on the table between them. The terms were not cruel. That had been a deliberate choice, and not an easy one to get through the council. Some members had wanted something harsher: reparations, territorial concessions, a permanent Terran military presence inside Dominion space. Avery had argued against all of it, not because she was soft on what the Dravhari had done, but because she understood the difference between a consequence and a punishment. A consequence changes behavior. A punishment often just changes the direction of anger. The terms were simple and absolute. The Dravhari would withdraw from all Viali systems immediately and completely. they would recognize Viali territorial sovereignty, guaranteed by Earth. Any future military action against non-combatant civilizations within a defined corridor of the Vega cluster would be treated as a direct act of war against humanity and responded to accordingly. There were no financial penalties. There was no occupation. There was only the line, drawn clearly, with the full weight of what had just happened standing behind it. Veth Orun read the document carefully. He read it the way someone reads something when they are looking for the hidden part, the place where the real cost is buried in careful language. He did not find one. The document said exactly what it appeared to say. He looked up at Avery. "Your kind came for a species that could not fight," he said. "I have been trying to understand why." Avery met his eyes. She did not answer immediately, because she took the question seriously, the way she took all questions. Because someone had to. And we have spent a long time in our history waiting for someone else to be that someone. We got tired of waiting. Veth Orun looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the document and signed it. On the surface of the Viali colony, the rebuilding had already begun. It was slow work. The shelter dome was still the center of everything. The 4,000 survivors had not yet spread far beyond it, partly because the outside world still felt dangerous to them in a way that would take time to heal, and partly because they were waiting. They did not know exactly what they were waiting for. They just knew that something had changed, and that change had not fully arrived yet. Petra spent most of her days inside the dome, working with Esselvan on the damaged data crystals, running careful recovery scans, trying to pull out whatever fragments of the library could still be read. Some of the crystals were too far gone, others held more than expected. Each piece of recovered text, or song, or historical record that came back intact felt like finding something that had almost been permanently lost. And Petra handled each one with the same careful attention she would give to something irreplaceable, which it was. On the evening of the 11th day after the last battle, she sat outside the dome for the first time, on a piece of broken stone that made a reasonable seat. The air was still carrying traces of the chemical residue from the attack, but it was thinning day by day. Above her, the Terran fleet sat in low orbit, a slow ring of lights moving across the dark sky, steady and unhurried. Esselvan came and sat beside her. It moved carefully, the way it always moved now, conserving something. But its skin was brighter than it had been on the first day. The gold was coming back slowly, like warmth returning to something that had been cold for too long. They sat in silence for a while. Petra watched the fleet lights move overhead. Esselvan watched them too. Then the elder began to hum. It was a low sound, resonant, felt more than heard. And as it hummed, its skin began to glow in a slow, steady pulse. Deep gold, then amber, then gold again. Petra recognized the pattern immediately. She had read about it in 3 separate academic papers, and had never expected to hear it in person. It was the Song of Debt That Cannot Be Paid, an ancient Viali composition that had no equivalent in any human language, because humans had never built a word for gratitude so large it had no edges. It was reserved for moments when what had been received was so far beyond what could ever be returned that the only honest response was to simply say so, in the oldest and most sincere way the Viali knew. Petra did not speak. She did not translate it, or record it, or reach for her professional vocabulary. She just sat with it, and let it be what it was. Above them, the fleet held its orbit, steady, watchful, a ring of light around a wounded world that was, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to heal. It had started with a broken signal in the dark, heard by one tired man drinking bad coffee at the edge of the known galaxy. It had moved through a room of difficult people, making a hard decision. It had come down through the barrel of a war that cost real lives and left real marks. And it had arrived here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the sound of an old song being sung by a being who had almost stopped believing anyone would come. Someone had come. That was enough.